Good evening, everyone, and a very happy new year to you all. Welcome back if you're a regular attendee of our webinars, and I know many of you are, and a very warm welcome if this is your first one. I'm Katie Williams, Technical and Product Development Manager here at Dengie, and I'm delighted you can join us this evening. Before I introduce my guests, I'd just like to highlight that we are recording the webinar and it will be available on the Dengie YouTube channel in the coming days. There are lots of other recordings there, so please do check them out. There's lots of information for you to access. To help the quality of the recordings, we have audience mics and cameras off, so please put any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A boxes. There are some Dengie colleagues, Tracy and Claire, behind the scenes who will help me by answering the feeding questions if any come in as we go along. If there's time, I'll share them at the end. We always aim to finish by 9 p.m. as it is a school night, but we'll try to make sure that there will be a Q&A session, certainly for James and Tim. So to our two speakers this evening, Tim, I know you're there, I can see you in the background, so whilst James is speaking, we'll liaise behind the scenes. But first of all, I would like to introduce James Pheasant. James is a partner at gunnercooke, a law firm, and his specialism is equestrian, particularly sort of horse racing and some of the dispute resolution areas that he covers. He's ranked in chambers and partners for his work in equestrian and horse racing, and particularly in the context of prohibited substances. He has also represented elite level athletes in other sports too, which is something I didn't know, James, so I learned that when I was reading your biog. I think it's fair to say there is no one more experienced in this area than James, and I've heard him speak on several occasions, and he's very skilled and adept at making these sort of complex legal situations much easier to comprehend, even for people like me. I've asked James to discuss this evening sort of what we can do to reduce the risk of issues occurring. So it's a really hot topic for us equestrians with things like prohibited substances. I'll cover a little bit on the practical side, what we can do at Dengie, but James is the expert on the sort of reducing the risks and being prepared. James has had a particularly challenging week this week, so I'm incredibly grateful he's given up his evening to join us. So I will hand over to James, and hopefully the technology will work. Are you okay to share your screen, James?
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Some billing, which I'll endeavour to, I'll do my best to live up to that. I was reflecting just as I was preparing that the last time, I think, Katie, you and I and Tim shared I'll talk while I'm trying to find my slides as well. Can we see those?
Yes, that's coming through.
You've got those? Yeah, well, we were in person at Highclere, and the world has, to some extent, changed quite a lot since then. I don't think we were nearly as familiar with Zoom as we are now. But in other ways, and certainly as far as the anti-doping context and equestrianism goes, things remain the same. And if anything, the pressures are, I'd say, greater on riders now in terms of rising costs, and that applies equally to those that are providing the inputs into the system. And so it's still a very challenging environment. There have been some developments which make I think the landscape slightly easier to navigate, but certainly we're in the same arena that we were back in, whether it was 2018 or 19, I can't remember. So I've chosen. Is it working, by the way, the slideshow?
It is. You're not actually in presenter view, so we're seeing the slides. I mean, it doesn't matter, but it's just if you want to go from the beginning bit, just there, that might just.
Does that work?
There you go. Perfect. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I chose the title, looking for something vaguely snappy, riding the line, staying between the flags. We talk a lot in my business, dispute resolution, about risk mitigation, sort of charting the waters and navigating the rapids. You hope that you're always going to be in a situation where you're charting the waters rather than navigating rapids, but occasionally we do end up in that situation. So I'm going to look at risk management more than the sort of crisis management side of things, where we can end up in problems. In order to do that, and I want to keep this as law light as possible, because I recognise that not everyone has the same appetite to go through sort of hundreds of pages of FEI rules, etc. But I think it's important to understand what the basic concepts are, so you've got something to hang that knowledge of and that understanding of the practical points. So we're going to look at, I called it the course. That's the framework of the rules. I think it's useful to understand a little bit about what the background to those rules are, because they're slightly different in nature to other rules that we have, those BHA rules insofar as they apply to horse racing, and the philosophies are different behind them, which drives some of the distinctions. What are those basic concepts? What are those building blocks that the rules build on? And as I said, nobody's going to read hundreds of pages here, and these are very, very dense rules, but there are actually some basic concepts that you can take out of that. And I think actually in a relatively short number of slides, it's possible to sort of have that basic understanding as to what the landscape is that you're competing under. I put procedure there. I have a slide on it. To be honest, it's really quite dull. So unless I'm speeding through everything very quickly, I'll probably just leave you with that slide. But the sanctioning regime is important to understand. Then we've got the practical tips for risk management, which is really what I'd like to focus on most. And yeah, what do you do if you fall? If you do end up in crisis management, there's a few takeaways there. So in terms of the legal framework, you've got that distinction between the BEF/FEI regime and the BHA regime. So FEI, BEF, we're talking about equestrian sports, we're talking about eventing, dressage, show jumping, vaulting, endurance, everything that comes under those regimes. BHA, horse racing. We've seen a move probably over the last sort of 5-6 years, I'd say, increasing where the BHA rules start to mirror the approach that the FEI rules take. And that means an increase in really harmonization and standardization that I've put there. The starting point for these rules actually comes from human sport for FEI rules. So it comes down from something called the WADA code. The World Anti-Doping Authority has a code, and that is a code for athletes. And it's a code that the IOC has signed up for, the International Olympic Committee. And it is by dint of that you end up in a situation where the FEI and the BF rules have to sort of fall in line with those, because of course eventing is an Olympic sport, and therefore to be part of that club, essentially it has to sign up to the same rules. But the slight, the obvious distinction there is that in human sport, athletes make their own choices. There's far less control over what a horse might ingest. And it also, there's no point just sanctioning a horse. You're looking to sanction an individual behind it. So that's, that drives some differences. But fundamentally, the WADA regime looks for a very standard, harmonized regime from the perspective, I suppose, that by treating everything as sort of the same in some ways, if you can put things in boxes and say, well, that's that case and that's that case, that's a search for fairness. I mean, a review of all the case law over the years would show you many cases where, from just a moral standpoint, you'd look at it and say, well, that's incredibly unfair, because it can lead to some really harsh outcomes. And certainly that's the case with the strict liability that's there. And the focus is on very sort of strict rules of evidence as to how you go about proving your case. So the rules, the FEI, the BEF rules, quite a mouthful there, EADCMR, I don't know why they didn't just call them the anti-doping rules. There's a range of offences under them. So you've got things like association with banned individuals, you've got tampering, you've got evasion, you've got use, attempted use. But the main one we're talking about here, really, and the one that will be of most concern to everyone, is that presence in a sample of a prohibited substance. And that leads to something called an adverse analytical finding. So if you look at the rules, you'll see AAF all throughout it. And so that's our sort of starting block is a prohibited substance. You need to go to the FEI prohibited list to see that. Is it found in a sample? And if it is, you have an AAF. And from there, that's the starting point for any case. You've got your person responsible. So that's the concept that was introduced by the FEI and the rule makers to try and put something on top of this idea that, well, how you can't make a horse liable for things. So what do? You make a person responsible. And that person responsible, which is actually very different to the BHA position, I should say, which is really generally the trainer, in almost all FEI disciplines, the person responsible is the rider, the primary person responsible. And so that is the person that the sanctions fall upon in the event that something goes wrong. Now, there is some scope for support personnel as well, and that's particularly the case in the FEI got quite fed up of endurance and a lot of cases coming up there. So trainers have automatically sort of been, will be sanctioned there alongside the riders. But fundamentally, that's where the liability falls. And you've got the strict liability concept. So as soon as that substance is in there, as soon as the FEI has shown that there is a substance in a sample, you have an adverse analytical finding, their job is essentially done at that point. They need to prove that it's there to a scientific standard. But once that happens, then you're on a road to potential sanctioning. And to make matters even worse from a rider's perspective, you start from the presumption of fault. So of course we're used to the concept that everybody's innocent until proven guilty. It actually starts the other way around under these rules. So as soon as it's there, that is that kickstarts things, and there'll be this presumption of fault, and the onus is on the rider to have to show that in fact they are not guilty here. So there's two different regimes, one for prohibited substances, one for controlled meds. We'll look at that in a moment, just in terms of distinctions between them. Slightly different sort of sanctioning regime, and you'd much rather be into the controlled medications than prohibited substances. But fundamentally, all the concepts that I'm talking about here apply equally to both of them. And you have this very rigid sanctioning regime, which we'll look at. So in terms of the distinction between the two regimes, banned substances, what we're talking about what the BEF would say is cheating. It's that attempt to enhance performance. These substances have no place in a competition horse at any time, and therefore there is this assumption that there's been some nefarious doing, and so you're very much starting from the back foot there. And the sanctioning regime sort of reflects that extra severity that it's seen, those substances are seen at. Controlled medications, there is of course there's that understanding, that acceptance that horses need to be medicated. Indeed, for their welfare, it's important that they receive proper care, which involves veterinary treatment and medication. And therefore, there are substances that have great therapeutic value to the horse. But the particular concern here is around overuse of medications and potentially the use of medications to mask symptoms, and trying to get a horse into an event when really it would be best off resting, etc. So, albeit that is a significant concern for the FEI, it's not cheating, and therefore you have a slightly more flexible sanctioning regime, not quite as severe. I've put here beware withdrawal periods and detection times. I've lost count of the number of times I've seen cases where people have said, oh, but I respected the withdrawal period that my vet told me. It just won't really take you anywhere. There are even cases where the FEI engages in studies with certain bodies to look at withdrawal times and might have recommendations. That's not going to stop them running a case. So ultimately, that onus falls on the rider to make sure that, let's say their horse has maybe metabolizes the drug slightly slower, to make sure that they're on the right side of the line. Specified substances we'll talk about later. So you've got that concept of the adverse analytical finding. You've got the person responsible in any situation where you end up then with the substance in a sample. You are into a process where you're going to have to demonstrate your innocence, and we'll look at how that can be done in a moment. But if you're not able to do that, or you're on a track at that point for various consequences, and I should say these consequences are far more severe than those that you would tend to see under the BHA rules as well. So much of the BHA's regime, if we take out sort of substances which look like blatant cheating, sort of anabolic steroids and the like, you tend to be into more financial penalties. But under the FEI, BEF regimes, there are financial penalties, but the really, really significant ones are the periods of ineligibility. So the first thing to bear in mind is that the disqualification of the horse and ranking points, money, medals, etc., that come with those results, they will be automatically gone. So there is nothing you can do. You can go through the process and you can establish your innocence, and you can establish that in fact you don't bear any fault here. You can point to the precise route that led to the substance coming into the horse and show that you're not at fault for it, but it won't make a jot of difference to the results themselves. Now, there is some flexibility now for teams in that what they tend to do with the individual results is they can pull those out, and then, let's say there was a 4th place rider or something, they can come in and sort of add to those results. But certainly I remember having to deal with a case where in the end we didn't really do a lot with it, because it was all about the medal, and the medal was gone come what may. So it was deemed it really wasn't worth fighting. So it's pleasing there's a little bit more flexibility there. Periods in ineligibility, this is what it's really about. So your starting point is a 2-year ban if you're looking at a doping offence. So if you're something on the prohibited list that isn't one of these controlled medications, so we're not talking about bute, lidocaine, the various controlled meds, we're talking about prohibited substances, then you're into a situation of a starting point for a 2-year ban. And your second offence, you're looking at 4 years, and then your third offence, you're looking at lifetimes. Controlled meds, a bit different. You've got sort of 4 strikes and you're out, if you like, because that's when the lifetime bans kick in. You've got a starting point of 6 months for a controlled medication offence. I can't quite remember how they ratchet up, but I think it's sort of, I think it's doubling, and then it might be 2, and then it might be 4 years, something like that, until you get into the lifetime ban. The other thing that's not on this slide that's worth being aware of is provisional suspension. So certainly under the doping rules, you will tend to find that as soon as there is a finding of an AAF, there will be a provisional suspension set down. And so even if you're in a situation where you think, I know the answer to this, I know what's happened, I'm going to be able to prove my innocence, you would then have to make an application to the tribunal in order to have that provisional suspension lifted so that you can compete. And this can be a serious deal as well, because you may feel that you're in a position to be able to contest it, to be able to demonstrate your innocence, but these cases can take time to run as well. So you could be in a situation where you're even thinking, well, I'm going to be able to show that I'm innocent, and at the end of it, I'll have spent sort of 6 to 8 months effectively banned when I shouldn't have been. So there is a provision to be able to lift those provisional suspensions, but the starting point will be that that's what applies. Financial fines and costs, you tend to, I have to look at the figures, but you tend to be, I think, fines of around sort of 3,000 Swiss francs. I'm not quite sure what it is under BEF rules. And costs, you'd be looking at about 1,000 Swiss francs. So those are not insignificant sums of money. And I just referenced here reputational damage. All the cases I've fought, one of the challenges is trying to keep things out of the press, because it's just really, really hard to run a case and to be able to sort of do your work in the background to make sure that you can put in the best evidence possible, and in the same time you've got people commenting it and on it, etc. Now, really, really important, elimination and mitigation of sanctions. So those are that's the starting point for the consequences that you face if you're not able to do this. There is a 2-stage test. So the first thing you've got to do is you've got to establish how that substance got into the horse. And this has to be done by reference to evidence. So what does not work is speculation, theories, etc. I mean, I was just having a look through the recent cases on the FEI page earlier to sort of have a look at how cases are going through at the moment. And it's interesting. I mean, the most recent case is one called High Sticking in November last year. And there you have the FEI tribunal's position remains exactly the same. So in any situation where somebody is putting, well, it could be this and it could be that and it could be this, and these could all be very, very valid theories, you're not going to get anywhere with that. You need to be in a position to be able to point to a specific source and say, this is the source, and you need to be in a position where you can demonstrate that you are, over 50%, that is the cause of it, which is quite a challenging thing to do. Assume you can do that, then you're into your no fault and no significant fault. So you've shown how it got in there, but you then need to be able to demonstrate that in fact you don't bear any fault in relation to that. So, you know, for example, we could take at one end of the spectrum, if you're able to demonstrate that, in fact, this is a sabotage incident. You know, I've identified the wrongdoer, I don't know, they've admitted it, or, you know, sufficient evidence to show that that's the case. Sabotage is an example of where you would expect in those situations to be on the no fault. But of course, it might depend a little bit on what security is like, etc. Then you've got maybe at the other end of the scale, you know, potentially, let's just take a situation where, you know, you're looking at a controlled medication and the withdrawal period, and in fact, the horse has competed within that withdrawal period. Yes, you've been able to establish exactly how it got in there, but the FEI is going to say that then you are at significant fault, and you're not going to be able to get any discount on the sanction that would otherwise apply. So no fault is it's a high burden. It's about showing that you took all reasonable and, you know, practicable precautions. And I mean, I've had all kinds of battles with the FEI in this in the past. There was a point back in 2010 where the FEI tribunal was putting it to me that you know, one precaution that we could have taken, or my client could have taken, is just not to compete in the context of you know, use of a supplement. And fortunately, in that case, we were able to persuade people of what I say must be right, that you know, equestrian sport involves manufactured feed and supplements, etc. And it can't be right to say that, well, you'd still bear liability just because you chose to compete, and that competition requires the use of those feeds and supplements. But you are looking at a very rigid test for what is no fault or no significant fault, which is one rung down, effectively gets you 50% off what the sanction would otherwise be. Contaminated products. So this is a bit of an exception to the rigid sanctioning regime. Came in about 2015, and it's a recognition that there are, you know, products being used that in human sport, the WildTech is very, very dim view of the use of supplements, but there's a recognition that in horse sport, there is a requirement to use, you know, quite legitimately use manufactured feed and supplements, etc. And that these can sometimes be contaminated. And of course, you know, we know from, you know, the Nutr scheme, etc., and the ubiquitous nature of certain substances in our environment that this can happen. And so if you're in a contaminated product case, you are in a better situation. You're still going to need to show how exactly it got there. You're going to need to demonstrate that you don't bear any particular fault, or at least no significant fault in relation to that. So then we'll talk about it in a bit, but you're going through those steps that you took to assess the risk around the product. But if you're able to do that, you can actually get to a point where you're just at a reprimand, which, yeah, I would say is never quite as good as a full exoneration. But for most people, if we can get through this process and find that, in fact, they don't bear any liability, so to speak, then they would take that. Specified substances. So these, again, have come down from the wider code as a concept, but really here what we're talking about is you know, those substances that you would commonly see on the NOPS code. So you're thinking, you know, caffeine, morphine, theophylline, atropine, you know, in case you'll be able to reel them all off. But those kind of substances, and again, we're into a more flexible sanctioning regime there. Yeah, and again, you can be into a situation where you're looking at similar reductions to a contaminated product, but you're still in a situation where you're going to have to prove the source, and you're going to have to demonstrate that no significant fault again. So the evidential burdens remain. Does it add anything to contaminated products? I used to say it didn't. I kind of think it does now, because I just think that anything which offers a rider an alternative route to prove their innocence in something can only be a good thing. But there is obviously a substantial degree of overlap between contaminated products that we would see in equestrian sport and those specified substances, because frequently the contaminants we're talking about are those same substances. Now, FEI atypical findings policy, this came in 2021. I think it's a very welcome addition to the rules. The idea is to create that extra flexibility to try and avoid situations where people are put onto not a fast track, but a very rigid track towards having to demonstrate that their the source, the no fault, etc., to avoid what are some really draconian sanctions when quite clearly there isn't cheating that's been going on, etc. This is a situation where there are good legitimate reasons for that inadvertent ingestion to have happened. And so there's been this move to create extra flexibility. Now I've got my weird picture there of a horse tunneling, just because for me this is about almost through the sort of back door, through the side door, because you get to avoid all of the other rigmarole of the way the rules are set up, the procedure that's there. And most importantly, I think, if you're able to continue down the atypical findings route, then you're in a situation where the case will never be charged to start with. And if the case will never be charged, then you can avoid that disqualification. So this is the only situation, that you can be in where, in fact, you don't lose the result. You don't lose the the prize money, the ranking point, the medal, etc., that comes with that particular event. So I think that that is a welcome addition. It's that opportunity to nip it in the bud, as I've said there. It still requires identifying the source and the precautions that a rider has taken, but the process is a lot more opaque. So the FEI publishes a list of those cases. In 2021, I think there were 12 cases. 4 of them, it shows, managed to go through that process. The other 8, they decided, no, you're going to have to go down the AAF route. So it's not entirely clear exactly how the FEI, what its sort of analysis is, but or the way it treats those cases and the evidential standards. But I would bet that there is far more flexibility in that process than the Formula AAF one. I said it was dull, the really dull stuff, process procedure. I'll leave you with the slide. To be honest, if you're ever reading this, it's because you've got a problem, and knowing how this works isn't going to stop you getting to that problem. So anyway, it is there. Right. So riding the line, how do we go about trying to avoid getting into a scenario where we're into crisis management? What risk management strategies are we looking at? I've got here a bit on the challenges that are inherent in this process. I think it's helpful to understand that, so you know what you're going into. Practicalities around proving innocence under the rules. It's really important to understand the level of sort of evidential burdens there, because that drives the steps that are required, both to avoid getting into a problem, but also if you get in that problem, into that situation, being able to demonstrate that in fact you don't bear any fault. And then a little bit on those particular risk management strategies and what I recommend. So key challenges for riders: you start with nothing. Generally, you don't even know what the substance is. I mean, you might know, if it turns up and it's morphine or it's theophylline, caffeine, etc., then you're going to have some idea of it. But often you go into this and the substance that turns up isn't one, because some very strange contaminants can end up in things as well. And you're going to be scrabbling around trying to work out what this is and how on earth it got there. Generally also, by the time you're notified of it, it's definitely going to be weeks. It might even be a couple of months. So you're in a situation where evidence, it didn't happen yesterday. So it's not a case of just being able to say, where was I yesterday or what happened yesterday? Generally, you're thinking about 1 or 2 months, and that introduces challenges straight away for records. So the need for good record keeping is even more important because of that time that will have passed. You've got very, very tight timelines on making decisions. The FEI will try and drive a process quite quickly, and these decisions need to be made quickly, which just introduces further pressure and the need, again, to be able to have things at one's fingertips. Unique physiology of the horse, it's important to be aware of it. The FEI will fight these things tooth and claw. This is not a investigative process which looks to say, oh, look, this has happened. Can we work with you to work out how this has happened? It will be treated very much as an adversarial process of, we want to win, essentially, will be the FEI's way of going about it, because there are lawyers working for them, and that's what they, that's what they're paid to do. So pharmacokinetics comes up a lot. So it's about demonstrating that actually, the levels that are in the horse match up with the levels that are in the sample, and it's complex stuff. So there's a real weight of evidence required to rebut that guilt. Little point on cost there. this stuff costs money, but the real thing that I really have a problem with is that you can never get a cost order really against them. So you can do all this, you can win your case, and you're still left with a cost bill at the end of it. So practical issue 1, identifying the source, analysis of the horse's recent movement. So it's going to be really important to be able to demonstrate and provide cogent evidence to the FEI tribunal as to exactly if you're going to be pointing to an event that's happened or something, and you're saying, oh, I think it happened here, you're going to have to identify exactly where that horse was when. The records are important there. Testing across all feed and supplements in use. If you're in that situation, then that's one of the things you're going to be looking to do very quickly. Investigating the manufacturing chain backwards and forwards. So this is developed again from my having to identify the source. The requirements are really quite onerous to be able to demonstrate exactly where that contamination occurred. So it's not necessarily enough to just be saying, ah, it's in that product, that's it. You may find that the FEI are probing for you to be able to demonstrate, well, how did that product actually get contaminated? And so I think it's very important when you're thinking about the products that you use to think about, well, how many inputs are there in here? Because multiple inputs in the manufacturing chain, they create more risk, and they will create problems if you're in a situation where you're having to demonstrate exactly where that contamination might have occurred. You're going to be reliant on third parties. Again, that goes back to me to be able to doing your due diligence in advance, having good relationships with your suppliers. But you should be in a situation where your suppliers are quite happy to answer questions about exactly where are their inputs, etc., their QC procedures. So it's going to put you in a better position to identify the source straight away. I think let's leave establishing the primary source. It's a bit of an argument that they've come up with. Records, I've mentioned it already. It goes down to even the packets, because you may be in a situation of having to demonstrate that it was actually that particular batch that was fed, and actually it was really important in one of my old cases years ago, where they'd actually kept all the containers they were using for sort of polish and brushes and the like, and it was really, really important. Nowadays, you might just take iPhone pictures of them, but something to be aware of. Reasonable precautions. Yeah, we've got that, taking all practical steps. It's a very, very high bar. And so the more that you can be in a situation of saying, and having done, because it doesn't really work to do it afterwards. You can't say, well, after it happened, I did this and I did this, and I went on the internet and I checked it out, etc. These things, you're going to have to demonstrate that you did all these things before you used the product, and that you went, you went into using the product in good faith with good reason for using it for all of those reasons. Your support personnel is really important. You're going to be relying on your vets, your grooms, etc. So it's really, really important that they are bought into it. Legitimacy of products. The more commonplace something is, the more that it's routinely used, then the more that the regulators are going to look upon that and say, well, yes, that's perfectly reasonable, as opposed to something that's just been found off the internet and is a bit esoteric. I'm going to talk about compliance with FEI guidance in a moment, so I'll skip on from that. Steps taken to investigate a product. What we're talking about here is making sure that you've done all your due diligence beforehand, and it's credentials of all those in the supply chain. So it goes back to what I said about multiple inputs. If you've got, you could have a very, let's say, on its face, a reputable product, but if that product relies upon input, coming in from Indonesia, from China, from lots of different places, looks good on the box, but actually when you dig into it, those behind it don't have those same credentials, then you're going to be in difficulty. Reliance on prior use. The FEI don't like the idea that people say, look, I've been using this product for 5, 6, 7, 10 years, I haven't had a problem with it. But actually it is a relevant factor. So the more that you've been using something for a long period of time, the better position you're going to be in. And of course, the less risky it should be as well, because you have that history of use. In terms of risk management strategies, one of the buzzwords came in sort of 4 or 5 years ago, assess the need, assess the risk. Really, the regulators wanted to see that people weren't just, oh, I'll try that product, I'll try that product, I'll try anything. The idea was, do you really need to use that product? Is there a good nutritional, my lights have just gone off in here, I don't know, well, hopefully you can still see me. Is there a good nutritional or welfare reason to be using that supplement, that feed, etc.? So that's really a starting point, is start from the position, I need to, why am I using it, and what is the risk involved with it? Knowledge is king. So the list, know the FEI prohibited list. There's no defense to saying I didn't really know it was on there. So that's important. And their approach to supplements, be restrictive around them. There's even something on the website that talks about putting them in a medication logbook. So that's the sort of the way they look at them. They're like an additive. And then you've got their guidance on contamination prevention. I put a link to it there. To be honest, most of it is just really basic common sense advice. But by looking at it, you forewarned is forearmed. But also, if you ever ended up in a situation, being able to say, yes, I read the guidance and I knew it and I followed it, etc., will be helpful. And of course, you want to know exactly what's going on with your own feeding regimes, practices, etc. You want to just be all on top of those as opposed to delegating them to other people. And then that just builds in those extra risks then of not quite knowing what's been happening with them. Risk management strategies, due diligence, ingredients. The first thing you need to be doing is making sure you know everything that is in that product. And you should, let's say there's an internet search to be able to identify them, important to keep that evidence of it. So I don't know, you take a screenshot or you write down somewhere, you say, I went on the internet and I looked at it, and this is what I found. So at least I know what was in that product. Then you've got your supplier credentials. So this is where it comes down for me of really working with your suppliers, asking them questions. Where are the inputs coming from? What are their quality control procedures? Do they retain samples? That would both be evidence of the credibility, the credentials of the manufacturer, but also it would really assist in dealing with crisis management if you get there. Records, can't say it enough. This might be, for instance, signs and around the stables, but also checklists, anything where the FEI can see both that there's an attempt that's been made to record things, but also in having those things recorded, you're just going to be in a much better position to avoid the risk of something happening. I've put samples of products wherever possible. I think that I get that people don't just want to they want bags of sacks of feed all over the place and keeping every single batch. But personally, I think I would be at least keeping a sample for, say, 3 to 6 months of any new product and any new batch of a product. Cross-contamination protocols, that's kind of in that guidance. I'd have a look, you're always thinking, what steps can we take to make sure that there's not a risk that medication might get cross-contaminated, different colored buckets. This will all be, I know I'm teaching everyone to suck eggs here, but the more you can be thinking about those things, the lower the risks are going to be and the more protected you're going to be. Product screening prior to use, I think I would recommend new products, certainly that you haven't used before. I think it is worth doing a screening test. They're not that expensive. It's not something that's mandated, but certainly something to think about. Finally, crisis management. If you end up there, if despite everything you've done to avoid, and look, accidents happen, things happen, so you can do your utmost, and cases show that people can do their utmost and they can demonstrate no fault, but the unthinkable still happens. The first thing you do is you just lock everything down. You make sure that nothing is thrown away. You need to preserve all that evidence. It's an evidence-driven process, and it's absolutely critical to make sure that you've got the evidence. You could have the best case in the world, sort of on paper in some sense, but you haven't got the evidence to back it up, you'll lose. Trace the movement, so you're going to have to go backwards and think, right, what happened here? Get diaries out, start, cross-referencing. All of that's going to be important. I think early legal advice, I would say that, of course, but you know what? Just a really small bit of legal advice at an early stage can really help, and actually could save, potentially the need for the legal advice later on, because it puts you on the right track. Check insurance policies. I don't know if the industry bodies provide any legal expenses insurance. They actually do in horse racing, but some policies, household policies, will even have it. That would be really helpful. the FEI will put loads of pressure on you. It will absolutely drive you to run through this process faster than you should. And the rules are set up for that. And so it's actually really important to ask for more time to investigate, because you will get it. But a lot of people maybe just assume that they have to just follow what's set out there. B sample, there's a right to ask for the B sample. Generally, I would ask for it. It hardly ever turns up negative, but it's not that expensive, and it does buy a bit of time. Obviously, one has to sort of balance that with the cost of it, but I think it is worth doing. And it goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning, or not very beginning, but a few slides ago, trying to deal with these issues, crisis management, when the press are busy writing things and saying and speculating on things, is just really fundamentally unhelpful. So what looks like a good quote at the time, and something which is speaking to someone's innocence, might actually be unhelpful at the end of it. So I've whizzed through that a bit, but hopefully that's been helpful. I think we're going to have some time for questions at the end.
That's brilliant, James. Thank you. So I'm just trying to get my screen to show. There we go. Yeah, I think as ever, there's some really key points, and I think you're far from teaching people to suck eggs, because even in recent times we walk onto yards and we see things like Diet Coke cans or Red Bull open, sat on people's forages, and in the feed room they have their coffee making stations. So these things are still hot topics. And one thing I was going to ask while we find Tim and see if we can get him set up, the whole sort of chance ride area. I think I remember a presentation before where you said if someone picks up a chance rider to show, they might not know the background to the horse, but it's the rider that is still liable, even though they've potentially had no contact with that horse previously. Is that still the case? They would be.
No, unfortunately it is. So, I mean, I've been asked in the past by riders saying, I really want to do it because, I don't know, there's like a GetX, or there's a great opportunity, and it's a case of sort of go into it with your eyes open, because if there is a problem with that horse, then fundamentally it falls upon you straight away. Now, yes, the regulator, the circumstance of it mean that you could say, well, look, it's not, I didn't know about it, and so that level of culpability seems less, but fundamentally you're still going to be into a process, unless you're into that sort of atypical findings, you're still going to be into a process where you've got to demonstrate the source. That's going to be more challenging. If it's just a one-off ride, then you don't have the background, you're reliant on other people, so you're on the back foot there. And reasonable precautions, again, you're going to be on the back foot. How did you know, what precautions did you take? Well, what precautions can you really take there apart from asking some questions? So unfortunately, it is still the case, and that is a problem.
Yeah, so accept those rides with caution. And
yes.
Definitely. Okay, brilliant. Are you okay to, I mean, obviously if you want to turn your screen off and things, but if you're okay to hang around while we do our bits, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, that'd be brilliant. Thank you. I'm not sure if Tim is there, or if he can hear us. Okay, I'm gonna see if he's behind the scenes. Doesn't seem to be on the panelist list, so. Right.
I think Tim's saying you can see and hear us on the chat. But...
Okay, but we can't see and hear him. Okay, hang on. I don't think, Tim, I think, let me just see if I can find you and turn your mic on. Yeah, I think because he's not your, I think you've gone on a different link, Tim. So we're probably, let's see if I can make you a panelist, because that's where the problem is. Okay, I will share my screen. So if Tracy doesn't mind liaising with you behind the scenes to see if she can get you in as a panelist, I might start my bit, if that's all right. Being very rude as the host. Where are we? Oh, no, that's not going to help. Bear with me, everyone. Here we go. Okay, so we'll figure out trying to get Tim onto the panelists link, but I'll go to my session. So I'm going to obviously talk about feeding aspects of the performance horse and touch on Nutr a little bit, because there are some areas that I think it's worth sharing some of the predicaments and challenges going forward into the future with prohibited substances, but also just more broadly, we're going to look at why use fibre as an energy source for the performance horse. We'll look at some of the key nutrients because we're reasonably short on time, so I'll focus on the ones that are most relevant to performance. And then, as I say, some thoughts about Nutr as well. So sports nutrition is essentially what we're kind of discussing this evening, but why is it important? And I think James really nicely highlighted some of the things there about assessing the need. You know, very much from the regulatory authority perspective, they want you to be using things that maintain a horse and enable it to perform, but they see the line between enabling to perform and be healthy and functioning normally, that anything you try to do to gain competitive advantage through your nutrition and feeding is potentially stepping into the area of a prohibited substance. And when you take the rules very literally, certainly for the racing authorities, you know, basically you're not supposed to put anything into a horse that has any impact on any of its physiological systems. Well, that pretty much includes water. So it is that sort of line between maintaining an animal's health and ability to perform, but not enhancing its performance. So effectively, good nutrition is certainly therefore going to guarantee, it doesn't guarantee you're going to win, but poor nutrition certainly increases your chances of losing. And what we're doing as nutritionists is trying to find that balance between keeping a horse healthy to train primarily as much as anything else, as well as actually perform on the day. And I think when you look back through sort of sporting success and achievements, and I think it's Dave Brailsford from British Cycling talked about sort of marginal gains. If you can improve 1% of everything, all the factors that contribute to your horse's overall performance, then that can be the difference between winning and losing. And certainly when it comes to nutrition, we have to try and maintain their health, because we're effectively taking a horse out of its natural environment and asking it to do something quite alien. And therefore, if we can keep them healthy enough to train, then we've got an increased chance of them performing well in the actual competition itself. And I always reference some human examples here because actually that picture quality is not great, I've just noticed. But I think, although it's nearly 20 years ago, this is a really memorable and pertinent point about someone that seemingly came from nowhere to have amazing, phenomenal success in one big competition. So 2004 Athens Olympic Games, which I hope some of you are old enough to remember as well as me, Dame Kelly Holmes achieved a double gold medal. And this is just from Wikipedia, which isn't always the most reliable source, but it's a nice quote about how she had no injury worries for just about the first time in her career. So to everyone else, it looked like she'd appeared from nowhere to win these, sort of massive 2 gold medals, having not really achieved gold medal success previously. But it shows that if you have the perfect training and preparation for a big event, you can achieve success. And essentially that is what we're trying to aim for with horses as well. And I think Jessica Ennis-Hill is another example of that. The times when she's most successful is when her training has gone to plan, particularly in a multidiscipline event. So finding that balance between health and performance, we do obviously need to try and understand how the horse's digestive system works to be achieving that balance. And we did do a digestive health webinar actually back in November, which is already on our YouTube channel. So it's much more detailed about overall health of the digestive system. But I've picked out some key points, particularly in relation to performance for this evening. And one of the diseases that we're probably most frequently talking about when it comes to the competition horse is ulcers, gastric ulcers. 25 or so years ago now, it was really identified to be a major issue for racehorses, and we thought it was specifically a kind of associated with that high level, high intensity exercise. As we've got more endoscopes or gastroscopes available to us to look in more and more horses, we're finding it in lots of places, but certainly there is a correlation between level of exercise, intensity, duration, and therefore the performance horse inevitably has to spend more time training and in exercise and out of its natural environment is going to be at increased risk. So when grazing, the gastric pH in that sort of squamous region, which is very vulnerable to ulcers, is around 4 or above. But with a performance horse, we know they're going to have less time at grass, and therefore they have that or lack that trickle effect of the pasture or the grass coming in, acting as a buffer and the chew time associated with that. And we know, obviously, because they're travelling and competing for longer periods, they're not going to have access to any feed. So we're taking away that almost continuous trickle feeding when they're at pasture, but we're also taking away things like hay and other forages that they might be on, possibly when they're traveling, certainly when they're exercising and competing. And again, if you're competing in several classes in one day or multidiscipline events, then you tend to be exercising for longer or have the absence of food for longer. And we have this splash effect. So if we exercise horses on an empty stomach, there isn't that fibrous mat that we normally see that acts as a physical barrier. So the fibre can mop up the acidic contents of the stomach, and it also acts as a physical barrier to stop the splash effect. So as these horses move, especially at speed, the stomach will compress as well. So it's becoming a little bit smaller. So there's the increased chance of the acidic contents coming into contact with that squamous epithelium. And obviously, if there's nothing there to stop it, i.e. food, then that problem is increased further. There are some areas we need to consider when we're thinking about ulcers. So forage being the key. If we can't turn them out to pasture, then obviously we tend to use conserved forages like hay and haylage as alternatives. What we're putting in the bucket, how much we're putting in there, when we feed in relation to exercise as well, and obviously those other management and exercise factors that we're going to take into account. So they're all things, as I say, there's lots of webinars and information on ulcers specifically, but one area that I think is worth focusing on is a study that was done a few years ago now, where they showed that actually making a dietary change is the thing that is going to make a difference, regardless of whether you've used the medication, which is typically omeprazole. So equine squamous gastric disease, so those sort of squamous ulcers in exercising horses was what they were specifically looking at, so not the sort of glandular ulcers. 12 pairs of horses with grade 2 ulcers, and then 17 pairs with grade 3 or above. So the grade 3 and above are the more serious ones. And you can see there, they were treated with omeprazole, scoped after 4 to 10 weeks. And the difference when they actually changed the diet, so reducing the starch content of the ration, was most significant in the grade 3 or above. The fact that there wasn't much change in the sort of slightly less severe ulcers potentially shows us why the individual variability. So there are certain factors that are going to contribute to ulcers. So the fact that they're exercising, the lower grade ones that might not actually cause the horse too much or too many issues. We tend to sort of accept a little bit more, possibly wrongly, that all forms of horses in exercise will have some level of ulcers, up to sort of grade 1 and 2. How significant they are really is down to that individual susceptibility, things like pain thresholds, where the ulcers are, etc. Generally, the 3 or above are accepted as the more severe, and tend to, not always, but tend to be the ones that impact on the horse to the point where it may compromise health and performance. And so it's there where we can have the greatest scope to make changes to the diet to really help get them back into work and being able to perform. And it is changing away from that higher starch diet down to a lower starch diet. As you can see there, the level in the high starch, 3.5 grams per kilo body weight, is well above the thresholds, which we'll come to in a minute. And the 0.94 is below the threshold that is considered to be basically safe. So it's in those worst case scenarios, really, where changing the diet can have an impact, because potentially at the lower grade, the basic things you need to do to have horses in exercise are potentially going to result in some fairly low grade ulcers. How much starch is a problem? Well, you just saw there the sorts of levels that can contribute to causing issues. The 2 grams per kilo body weight starch per day or more has been shown to double the risk of ulcers. So that tends to be the upper threshold that we recommend for a daily intake of starch. And then per meal, it's the sort of anything above 1 gram per kilo body weight starch per meal is seen to be an increased risk. So both are risk factors if you're exceeding the amount the horse consumes in a day and also the amount it consumes per meal, but fractionally the per meal is worse. So if you are going to feed higher levels of starch, the takeaway message from this really is to try and do it in as many small meals as possible. So even if the total is quite a lot, try to get it broken down into lots of smaller meals, and it might help reduce the risk somewhat. Now, obviously, with my Dengie hat on here, I would be tempted to go, or certainly would be going a lot lower than this as a general rule, and trying to get the starch as low as possible if we've got a horse with a recurrent ulcer problem. And I should also mention we do have a starch calculator on our website. So if you're interested, if you've got the amount you're feeding and the level of starch in the feeds you're using, you can see whether it comes out as low, medium or high risk. So just moving on from the stomach to the small intestine, and I think we've discussed this many times that horses are not well adapted to high starch diets. That's why we have the basic rule of feeding little and often, because it keeps moving of its own accord, because we mustn't exceed that capacity. If the starch reaches that sort of sensitive hindgut, then it tends to cause a lot of problems. Historically, we've talked about research in other species showing that the absorption capacity in the small intestine is reduced when those high starch diets are fed. So the higher levels of acidity seem to erode or degrade the villi that you can see there in that magnified image. And at last, we have a little bit of evidence to show the same is happening in horses. I mean, there's every reason to suppose it would, but there's a company in the US that's really starting to look at this. Now, obviously, it does tend to require euthanasia of horses, so it's not an easy research topic. So it's probably why it's taken this long to identify it in horses as well. But essentially, less is more when it comes to starch all the way through the digestive system. And that same company is sort of talking a lot about what the consequences are of those reduced villi in the small intestine. Not only are you reducing your absorption capacity, but you're also reducing the potential for your immune system to be working efficiently. The Peyer's patches are particular types of cells in the small intestine, and if you're eroding that sort of tissue, then you're basically compromising your immunity and your immune function. Now, performance horses are exposed to more pathogens by the very nature of what they're doing. They're traveling, competing, going to new places, meeting other horses. So that's really the last thing we want in terms of getting through a competition and recovering without picking up some bugs. And again, it really comes down to another reason why we'd use fibre as an energy source instead of cereals if we possibly can. What can go wrong? Leaky gut syndrome is certainly being talked about a lot more in terms of its impact on health and performance. And effectively, when you've got a healthy gut, you have a really good, strong, intact intestinal barrier. So if your horse is encountering harmful pathogenic substances, bacteria, whatever it might be, if you've got a healthy gut, then they can't penetrate through, and that's the sort of normal mechanism that the horse would have. So it's going to consume inevitably some harmful bacteria, but if they stay in the gut and pass through, in most cases, it's not going to cause a problem. what tends to happen in these lower fibre diets is that we're eroding that mucus layer, which is one line of defence the gut has against pathogens. We also then compromise the health of the cells in the epithelial layer, so the sort of tissue itself, and the gaps between the cells become bigger, and the gut is therefore more permeable or leaky. And those substances that shouldn't be escaping from the gut do start to cross that intestinal barrier and can enter into the bloodstream and into the body. So why is it going wrong? Too little fibre is effectively the answer there. And in the hindgut, we have this microbiota, so the microbial population that live there and are digesting fibre by fermentation. Fibre fermentation also produces heat. It keeps the horse warm from the inside out. And that is something when you are competing abroad in hot or in hotter conditions that we're seeing in this country as well, that you need to think about, because the horse will start to reduce his own fibre intake to regulate his own body temperature, because he knows when he's consuming that fibre, it's what's going to make him hot from the inside. So again, we can have quite a battle to get horses competing and living in these really hot countries, places like the Middle East. Trying to get them to eat enough fibre is a challenge. We've talked about starch reaching the hindgut causing digestive disturbances. I think we're all familiar with that now, but increasingly, and this was reported in one of the presentations at the European Workshop on Equine Nutrition, which was hosted in the UK back in August last year, and they're talking about the fact that we're starting to understand a lot more between the link between the microbiota and behavioural issues as well. And some work that we collaborated with researchers at the University of Edinburgh at the time certainly showed this. Probably about 10 years or so ago, we started to look at this, where horses on a comparable diet using fibre and oil versus cereals, those on the cereals were much more reactive to novel stimuli. So more spooky in normal language, but we didn't go as far as looking at the bacteria themselves. It was the sort of diet and the effect. And now, probably 10, 12 years on, we're starting to see that the role that the microbiota might have in that as well. Bugs that break down fibre also produce B vitamins by fermentation. So again, you're getting things like B12 that are needed for energy metabolism. And it's a basic rule of thumb, isn't it? If an animal is healthy on the inside, it usually means they're healthy on the outside. So our clues to make sure that the gut are healthier are normal droppings, things like good coat and hoof condition, the other obvious biotin, other obvious B vitamin being biotin, that's too many Bs. So, crumbly, poor quality hooves, which we can see in performance horses, thoroughbreds quite commonly. It's often an indication they're not getting enough fibre, so they're not fermenting the fibre and producing the B vitamins such as biotin. So, there's a reason we need to look at our horses, look at their health and condition, and we're making a judgment about their overall and internal health as well. An area that gets overlooked quite a lot, in my opinion, is the lymphatic system. So the horse has a very high number of lymph nodes relative to humans, so around about 8,000 compared to 600. So even proportionally against sort of body weights and body sizes, that's a lot of lymph nodes. And these nodes are effectively slowing the movement of the lymph. So the lymph fluid is taking waste products from exercise, basically detoxing the body. Now, 4,000 of these nodes are actually in the horse's colon. So the peristaltic movement, so the movement of food through the gut, is what is clearing and helping these nodes and the fluid to move through them. So the lymphatic system doesn't have a pump, so it's not like the circulatory system with the heart that pumps fluid around the body. It's working under pressure. So things like exercise and constant movement of the gut are what is helping the horse to detox its own body. So it's why we recommend a cool down after exercise, so sort of 20 to 30 minutes if you can, and or some turnout, so free range exercise, but also why we're trying to encourage people to feed more fibre, feed continuously, and not reduce the time the horse is eating, because again, he's constant, that sort of continuous herbivorous approach to eating almost continually is helping to make the lymphatic system effective as well. So important function. So just moving on from the gut then and the importance of sort of fibre and how we're trying to balance health and performance, to looking at what we can fuel the work with. And I see quite a lot of misinformation out there where people talk about, oh, if the horse isn't fed cereals, it's not getting any glucose, and glucose is the energy source of the brain, and therefore it's, can't sort of be functioning properly. Well, clearly, horses in their natural environment are just eating forages and fibres and pastures and things, and getting enough sugar and glucose for its brain to function there. So we know that there is sugar in grass. 10 kilos of hay, for example, would give you about a kilo of simple sugars. It's 10% sugar in hay. Now that doesn't include the storage form of the sugars. In some of these forages, they can be 20–30%. So there is quite a lot of sugar there if the horse really needs it. Now the sugar itself is providing energy. So we're getting 16 megajoules of energy. But there's also energy coming from the fibre. This is the whole point of the fact that the horse is a herbivore. It relies on bugs to break the energy down from fibre, or break the fibre down to release energy, but the horse then utilises that energy. So actually, the hay overall is supplying in the region of, say, 40 to 50 megajoules, which is a reasonable proportion of the average horse's maintenance requirement. Now, levels in pasture are obviously going to vary throughout the year, and we are talking about maintenance levels and requirements here, but it just goes to show that there is a lot of energy, and the form of the energy, yes, it's coming from fibre, but there is also sugar there as well. So there's a little bit of quick release energy coming from your forage. Now, the levels of sugar and things within forages causes some confusion. So we're going to try and dispel some of those myths this evening, and I do use this slide a lot, so apologies if you have seen it before, but I think it bears repeating. In a normal grass hay, so in here we've got a dry matter, it's very dry, 88%, so roughly 12% moisture. It's dry, so there's no fermentation, it's not wrapped, it's just a baled form of hay. There is around about 10% sugar. In this particular example, that included the storage sugar, which is quite unusual. Now, if we move across to the very far side, so the silage there, you can see the dry matter is much, much lower. So only 30% of what the horse is consuming is actually the fibrous material. 69–70% of it is actually the water. So these are very wet forages if they're a true silage. Now, you can see the sugar, these data, the hay, the haylage and the silage were all taken from the same field at the same time. So you can see that the sugar was there originally because we can see it in the hay, but what has happened is that it's actually been fermented because it's a wrapped forage, it's a silage. And so our marker for the fermentation is lactic acid in this case. So you can see that's come right up. There's none in the hay because we haven't got any fermentation going on, but there's lots, relatively speaking, in the silage, but the sugar level has dropped right down because that has actually been converted to the lactic acid through the fermentation process. Now, the haylage, you can see there, is sort of roughly in the middle. It's drier than the silage, but it's obviously not as dry as hay. It's a wrapped forage, so you're going to get some fermentation. So the sugar level has dropped a little bit and the lactic acid has come up a little bit, but it sits somewhere in the middle. Now, the bits highlighted in yellow are actually data that we've taken from our analysis that we do for customers, and it's what we're calling, and what Cecilia Muller, who has done the other research in this slide here, is calling a wrapped hay. And I think it's a really useful term because these forages, yes, they are wrapped, but they are so dry that they are not fermenting. So you can see the sugar level is just as it would have been if it was a hay that wasn't wrapped. And because there's basically no fermentation going on, the lactic acid levels are very low. So as a sort of energy supply, there is more sugar in these sort of wrapped hays or hays because it hasn't been converted to the lactic acid. Now, that's not to say that it's going to be lower energy, because obviously we know horses tend to do better on things like haylage, and that's often because they are more digestible, because usually they are cut earlier, but the horse is perfectly able to get energy from that end product of fermentation. So we've used lactic acid in here, but would also include other fatty acids. So it's just to try to make the point, the difference between sugar and other energy sources, but there's a combination of all these energies in these forages, and that's why they fuel performance horses in many cases perfectly well enough. When it comes to the bucket feed, the sort of fibre or high fibre materials that we have available to us range in their digestibility. So anything that tends to be cut later tends to be less digestible and therefore have less energy in it, because the animal can't get the energy out of it in time. The digestibility stops them from doing that. Those that are more digestible, so in this case, you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the high energy is the sugar beet, and that is very digestible because it's a source of fibre that doesn't need a lot of structure to it. It grows underground, so the soil is supporting it. It doesn't need that really indigestible material to give it structure to stand up tall above the ground like the other forages on there do. That's why it's so super digestible, and we tend to refer to it as a super fibre. So on the left, we have the straw, which is the least digestible. Then you've got things like dried grass and then alfalfa with the 10 megajoules. Now, I've highlighted those energy values because they are easily comparable to low energy and medium energy sort of mixes and cubes. And again, if we use these really good super fibres that are very digestible, they can make a significant contribution to the performance horses' energy requirements. They're still high fibre materials, so they're great for their health and sort of well-being. And if we want to increase the energy density even further, then we can add oil as another ingredient to these feeds to provide plenty of fuel to support these horses in work. Now, I mentioned the UN conference that was held in the UK back in August, and there was some data published presented at that conference. It's also been published and presented in the US as well. It was a study carried out by the Lab to Field Research Centre. They're based in Dijon in France. And it was a study, interest of full declaration. It was a study funded by some friends of ours at a company called Dist, who are based in France. We collaborate with them, but I would emphasise that it was their study. We didn't fund it in any way at all. So although we have mutual interests, it wasn't funded by us, so reasonably independent information. They compared French trotters fed meadow hay plus rolled barley, and then they added things like alfalfa and sugar beet to those rations. So these horses were in work, French trotters sort of working quite hard. And the horses receiving more of the fibre in their rations actually showed less dysbiosis. So effectively, that means less disruption to the microbial populations in both their stomachs and their feces. So as a marker of their hindgut function. Now, in the study, 16% of the ration was alfalfa, which is a relatively low inclusion, but it was still enough to help to counteract the effects of that rolled barley in the ration. Now, again, with my Dengie hat on, do we need the rolled barley for many of these scenarios? Probably not, but these researchers were trying to replicate a typical scenario where someone training horses will be using some form of cereal, and they were looking to see how much sort of different types of fibre they would need to put in to try and counteract some of those effects. So they found around about 16% of the ration helped to sort of reduce the variability and the impact on that microbial population. Now, I would hasten to add here as well that horses, anything biological, whether it's human, animal, plant, whatever, there's a huge amount of individual variability. Animals vary very much between one another and within, and particularly when you're looking at the microbial population, there are so many factors that can influence the particular bacteria present in our guts, in our horses' guts, almost hour by hour, and certainly on a day-by-day basis. So these studies are always very difficult to repeat and to show additional effects, but so to get some sort of positive result from this was really good, quite frankly. And the other interesting thing that I feel came out of it was, we always talk about sugar beet pulp as being abundant in pectin, a really good source of this sort of soluble or highly digestible fibre. And we've always known that alfalfa also contains pectin, but what this study showed was that actually specifically the bacteria that break down the pectin in particular increased significantly when the alfalfa was fed. So it's indicating that in this study there was a good level of pectin within the alfalfa. Why is that important? Well, in the performance horse, hydration is obviously key to success and being able to perform. Pectin as a type of fibre is known to act as a fluid reservoir. It's broken down very easily in the gut and it releases that water. So the fact that alfalfa is this good sort of source of like a fluid reservoir and acts in that way, just like sugar beet does, is really positive. And the picture on this slide is our alpha beet. It does combine alfalfa and sugar beet, and it never looks the most attractive feed to use. Horses generally like it and seem to eat it very well, but it's probably one of our best kept secrets, because in terms of the combination of quality fibres that you're getting, you feed it soaked, so it takes a huge amount of water into the gut, which is beneficial in the first place. It's broken down very quickly because of these high levels of pectin, and it's releasing that water for helping your hydration status. So it coincidentally is our chairman's favourite product, but he uses it for sheep rather than performance horses. Moving on just to look at energy and starch. So again, I use this slide a lot because it just nicely illustrates when we put something like alpha oil, and it would apply to any alfalfa and oil combination really, and we're matching the energy levels of some of these really high energy mixes and cubes. So anything with a DE value of 12 to sort of 13 megajoules per kilo is what we would consider to be high energy. But the difference is the starch level in an alfalfa and oil combination is only 2%. So there are some mix and cubes that are starting to come down in terms of the starch values. So 13 there, I think I've got the next slide is sort of 8 to 13 are the sort of lowest I can find. But so even then with those low ones, we're still 4 or 5 times lower in starch. And certainly compared to those traditional cereal-based feeds, it can be anything like 10 to 12 times less starch, but for the same energy. Now that there are some sort of cons to this scenario in terms of alfalfa and oil, sort of palatability and energy density, which we'll cover in a minute. But if we can encourage the horse to eat more of these fibre and oil combinations, it doesn't mean to say we're having to compromise on the amount of energy they consume. So as I mentioned, some of these lower starch feeds have come onto the market. The lowest one I can find is around about 8%. So still quite a lot higher. So, but just, I suppose the message from this slide really is do have a look. So they might be marketed and labelled as low starch, but do actually check the level. And if someone makes a declaration on their pack that it's a low starch feed, they should be sort of declaring those or making those levels available to you. Energy density is the key though. So where these things can have their place is if you've got horses that won't eat the volume of a sort of chopped fibre that is going to be needed to get the right level of energy in. So they do have a place, but they should be, in my opinion, used judiciously or certainly sparingly. I just put this example ingredient list on here again because I think it's quite interesting. People like the look of mixes and cubes, which is fine. But when you actually look at the ingredients list, they're just taking things that you could actually use and create your own sort of ration from. Yes, these are convenient because they've got the vitamins and minerals added, but if you typically use a balancer or a supplement anyway, you can reconstruct this diet yourself. So do look at what you're getting and what you're paying for what you're getting. Now, in terms of oil as that additional energy source alongside these quality fibres, then the maximum suggested in the total diet, and we don't just mean the bucket feed, we mean the total ration, including the hay, would be around about 10%. Now, this is going some because A, it's not the most palatable ingredient for horses to consume, and I think we probably don't really fully understand what impact the level of oil itself might well have on the microbiota in the stomach and all the way through the digestive system, but also the bile acid impact. So the horse doesn't have a gallbladder, its bile is draining continuously into the small intestine to break the oils down, and those bile acids will interact and are processed, if you like, by the microbiota themselves. And certainly in other species, we're seeing things being labelled as bile acid diarrhea or bile acid digestive upset. So yes, we know that horses can seemingly tolerate 10% of their total diet as oil, but personally I would try to avoid getting to those sorts of levels if you can. I don't think we fully understand the impacts, to be perfectly honest. Straight oil can be added to the rations. Linseed is a great source of omega-3. as a manufacturer, we're always trying to find that practical balance between the nutritional values, things like sustainability criteria, the stability of it. Unfortunately, the omega-3 rich oils are not the most stable. So if you want a decent period of shelf life on products and you can send them around the world into hot countries, it's not always the easiest thing to do. I would suggest that perhaps micronized linseed is often better accepted than really high levels of straight liquid oil. So that's obviously become quite popular, but there are high oil supplements that are available too, and you may well find those a more convenient way to feed. So I thought it might be interesting just to compare some of the pros and cons. Do want to stress that this is being objective, and the products on here, because Bailey's Outshine and Saracen Equidure are probably some of the most popular ones, and just comparing them really for interest to things like micronized linseed. As I say, if your horse doesn't eat linseed or you prefer the convenience of some of these other products, that's absolutely fine. The points I've highlighted in yellow really are the ones just to bear in mind. So if you're going to use a straight micronized linseed, it has the sort of inverse calcium to phosphorus ratio. So in the horse, we're aiming for 2 to 1, 2 calcium to 1 part phosphorus. So it's the wrong way round. Now we can address that, which the next slide will show, but it is a straight. So again, you have to bear in mind there's no significant vitamin E, and we need extra vitamin E if we're going to feed high levels of oil. Again, I'll come to that in a few seconds. The downsides usually to some of these feeds that are made up are the starch levels when you're comparing them to micronized linseed. Now, in the grand scheme of things, these feeds are fed at very low levels, something like 500 grams. So the contribution of starch is relatively small, certainly compared to some of those other traditional feeds. But if you're comparing it to a micronized linseed as an option, then it is going to give you more starch for the energy and oil equivalents. They do have the advantage, obviously, of having things like added vitamin E. So that, is obviously something positive to consider, and you may well find that a more convenient option, but it's just some of the key points to be aware of. I mentioned alfalfa is a great source of calcium, so not only is it buffering things like acidity in the digestive tract, but it acts as a nice balancer. So for things like straight linseed, if you wanted to add up to 500 grams and you've got a good heap scoop of alpha original, would be about 500 grams. As you can see there, the overall calcium to phosphorus ratio of those two ingredients is about 2 to 1. So just about where we need to be. Now, obviously, that will be impacted by other things in the diet as well. So if you're using a balanced feed in the bucket and you're adding both of these, it will help address those imbalances, but you also need to consider the forage. And when we're working with these elite sports horses, then obviously we'll be doing a forage analysis and looking at the ration as a whole. But it's just a nice way to show you that alfalfa can act as a sort of natural balancer. The importance of a balanced diet goes without saying. If you are fortunate to have a good doer, and they do exist, trying to compete at high levels. Just talking to one of our event supported riders at the weekend, she events at a really good level and is complaining about the fact that all of her horses are fat. So yes, they might be on restricted rations in terms of energy, but we must balance the diet, because if we just on pasture and hay, it's the trace minerals, they're all the things that act as antioxidants, and also vitamin E that it's going to be deficient in. And obviously the easy way to do that without too much extra energy is to use a sort of performance balancer. Which leads us nicely on to vitamin E. It is an important antioxidant vitamin. I've put there, remember, it is fat soluble, so it is one that the horse will store. So effectively you can go toxic for it if you feed too much. But for every ml of oil that we put into the ration above the basic requirements, then a horse is going to need 1 to 1.5 extra IUs of vitamin E. So a 500 kilo horse in hard work would need around 2,500 IUs. And then if we're adding that extra oil up to say 500 mils, then we might well want an additional 500 to 750 IUs. So you can see we're getting to quite high levels. The reason I've sort of highlighted that is that the performance balancers are on the market, and there's a range of them. I looked at most of them, and funnily enough, they're all the same sorts of levels of vitamin E. They are going to give you 2,500, which is meeting that basic requirement. So the feeding rate normally for these balancers for average horses is about 100 grams per 100 kilos. But if you're getting up to a horse in hard work, so for a 500 kilo horse, they're actually recommending twice the normal feeding rate. So it is quite a big jump that you do need to be aware of. And again, you might then need still more vitamin E if you're adding extra oil for some individuals. And that's where you might start to look at a specific vitamin E supplement, because if we start to go really high on other things, we can go give them too much. And just enough is the sort of message, isn't it? And too much can be as harmful as too little. So it's finding that right balance. But that's where nutritionists will help you. So if you are starting to increase your horse's work and thinking about all of these things, then that's what we're here to help you with, looking at all these specific sort of requirements, especially if you're going to increase oil over and above normal levels. And the last sort of area I want to touch on really are electrolytes. Sodium and chloride are what you'd find in table salt, and people are recommended to just add that for horses at sort of lower intensities, if it's in hotter conditions. But as you up the sort of workload, then potassium becomes increasingly important, and it's the electrolyte I would look for to make sure a product is of good quality. There is some debate over the inclusion of sugar. It certainly aids palatability, because one of the challenges with electrolytes can be getting them to consume them. It's possible that it's going to aid absorption. You can find papers and advocates for yes, sugar's needed, and then others that are thinking it's more questionable as to how much it's actually helping the absorption of electrolytes from the gut. But what it will do is aid palatability. So I would say if you've got a horse that's not had ERS, so muscle problems, or if it's not like an EMS case, overweight or insulin dysregulated, then potentially a presence of some sugar is going to be helpful in actually getting these animals to consume it. If you have a horse that requires a low sugar diet, then you might be you would certainly be better advised to try some of those without those higher levels of sugar, but your challenge will be getting them to consume them. And again, just a little bit of, I haven't put the name of the product on here because I'm a little bit critical of it, to be perfectly honest, but do look at what these things have got in it. Marketed as being helpful for recovery, but if it's just got table salt and no potassium at all in, then I would question that, because if you're using this, relying on this as a sort of substitute electrolyte supplement, that for me is a sort of misleading, and certainly for horses in higher levels, they would definitely need that potassium that you'd find in the good quality supplements. So for me, this product has got barley in, so it's giving you more starch than you really need, as well as molasses, so more sugar than there probably needs to be, and crucially from my perspective, no potassium, which is the key electrolyte for recovery. And again, if you want advice on products, you can contact the feed line, and we will critique things for you, give you a sort of fair assessment of things. We don't have an electrolyte supplement, so we've got nothing to be gained or lost by critiquing other products for you and giving you basically impartial advice on them. Finally, just on NOPs then, so from Dengie's perspective, it is something we take very seriously. We're lucky that we have the sort of traceability and provenance are kind of core to what we do. So over 95% of our ingredients are UK grown, and a large proportion of that are actually grown by ourselves and our very close partners here in Essex and Lincolnshire in particular. But the thing I wanted to draw attention to, and this is especially if you're, something to consider if you're growing your own forages, looking at your pasture that you have, and also to your suppliers for your forage if you're buying it in, especially it's sort of more like a local farmer rather than perhaps branded product. Climate change is certainly having an issue on, we're finding new plants appearing in our fields as weeds all the time. You also have to bear in mind what people around you are growing. Now, obviously, we border roads and houses and gardens and things, so people do have a tendency to lob things out of their windows as they're driving along. If that happens to be something like chocolate or contains other prohibited substances, you need to be aware of things like that, because they can get picked up in your forages, and it's what people might be growing in their gardens and then chucking over the fence because they've trimmed it back and don't see it as a potential anything sort of that could cause harm, and they can get picked up. But it's also plants that are just what we call volunteers cropping up around, and you need to be aware of what your horse might be consuming. And one of the points I did want to make is, obviously, James is dealing with some very high profile clients, but we've had people that have been competing at riding club level, also like regionals and championships, but it's riding club competitors that are being tested as well. So these are all issues that matter to all of us, the levels we're competing at, even if it's sort of more locally and not these sort of elite events all the time. Another point to make is that we have less chemicals approved for use on crops generally. And I'm sure most of us would think that's a good thing, but it does mean that there are more weeds and more things coming up and growing in amongst our forages than have perhaps done in the past. So vigilance is key. And again, if you like to buy organic and you can buy organic forage, then just be aware that, again, that won't have had any chemical treatment at all. So the vigilance of the person harvesting it and growing it is key in terms of making sure that there isn't something that shouldn't be in there. And do bear in mind that if you've got non-horse sort of focused suppliers, they're not going to be aware of things like the Nutr scheme. They don't necessarily understand the risks. And sort of James made the point about riders and insurance and things, but just make sure your suppliers, are they able to deal with the worst case scenario? Because if you can trace it back to their forage or the product they've supplied you, are they going to be able to cope potentially with the implications? Because if they're marketing it as suitable for horses, and particularly horses competing, then they are opening themselves up, in my understanding of it, to making sure that it should be free from things like Nutr. So they're all other questions you can be asking your suppliers. Right, I think that's the end. Again, just want to mention we did have some podcasts with Horse and Hound. So if you look on like the iTunes or Apple podcast and wherever you get your podcasts from the 31st of October, there's lots more. And we have Alex Bragg also talking in some of those about competing and how he manages his horses. So they're well worth a listen, especially if you're in the car or something. Right, I'm going to stop my screen share and see if we can find, have we had any luck behind the scenes with
we think so. Can you hear me?
Brilliant.
All right,
perfect.
yeah, just trying to liven all the bits up.
Now, are you able to share the screen as well, or do you want me to do that bit?
Yep, I think I can do that.
Sorry about the glitch.
Do I do basic or advanced for the screen share thing?
I would do advanced if you can. It should give you, I think, a better...
Is that share? No, that's not sharing with you.
Or I can do it if it's easier because it's on my...
Let's try that. Nope.
If I do it and then... oh, hang on. No, it's worked. There you go.
We're
on. So let me do intros again, because I'm sure although you will be familiar to many people in the audience, especially if they're a similar vintage to me, because they will probably remember you flying around places like Badminton Burley on legs 11. But what they may not know is Tim actually graduated from Bristol Vet School in 1994. Since then, he's worked as an equine vet, most latterly at the Stables Equine Practice in Somerset. And Tim is veterinary advisor to the US equestrian team and was a member of the Vet Commission for the 2012 and 2016 Olympic Games. Most of Tim's spare time is spent working at events across the UK. I'm not sure that counts as spare time, Tim, if you're actually working at events. And like most vets these days, I think Tim is an exceptionally busy chap. So again, I can't thank him enough for giving up an evening to share his insights and experience with this. And I think you're going to talk specifically about sort of travelling horses internationally, which probably is something we would all aspire to do, but probably have no idea what it actually involves. So over to you, Tim. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Katie. Well, thank you, Katie and James. I was quite enjoying the evenings listening, but now I need to just concentrate on my own PowerPoint presentation. And COVID has probably taught us all lots of good lessons, and unfortunately hasn't taught me enough about Zoom. So we'll give it a go. I think it's great at this time of year to be thinking about the season ahead and the spring and better weather, the longer days, and potentially travelling to some exotic places or even less exotic places. But the boring bit about the travel, particularly if you're, so I'm just trying to advance the slide a minute. If particularly if you're going to travel abroad, is the bureaucracy that surrounds it. And actually, COVID has been quite helpful, really. In that now, a lot of our clients understand the concepts of biosecurity, vaccination, PCR, swabbing, all the various testing that goes on to allow these sort of movements to occur. And having had to have COVID passports ourselves to be able to go abroad at times, the idea of having health papers for horses is a bit more of a familiar concept. Unfortunately, in the same sort of time frame, we've also implemented our exit from the EU, and that of course has had some significant implications for ease of travel. And as far as horses are concerned, it's made the whole travel to Europe process a lot more complex than it used to be. And I'm sure many listeners will be aware of some quite high profile incidences that there have been in the last couple of years of riders who have had their journeys interrupted or even had their journeys aborted because they've got as far as Calais and then found that their paperwork or some aspect of their horse's health passport was not as it should have been. So boring as it is, it's also really, really important to get it right. And as far as health papers are concerned, which is the bit that obviously us vets are most immediately involved with, it can often seem a bit mysterious to people why it's so complicated. It's only a few minutes at the end stage of the process to check the horse over before they travel, and people do often wonder why the vets seem to consider it such an onerous task and why it's such an expensive task. And the truth of it is there's quite a lot of paperwork and preparation required prior to ever getting anywhere near the horse, and we have to be fairly heavily accredited and re-accredited and take exams periodically to prove our worthiness to do that particular job. And so it's just one of those jobs where probably it's considered to be a bit of a burden by the clients, also considered to be a bit of a burden by the vets, but it is of course most important to get all these details absolutely right. Now, there's quite a few things you can do for yourself in terms of preparing to travel, and it does depend whether you're going abroad or whether you're traveling within the home country, and whether you're traveling as a privateer with just taking your own horse for your own leisure and pleasure, or whether you're transporting somebody else's horse and in so doing it as a sort of commercial venture. And there's also going to be implications for why you're going, whether you're going to compete, and if you're going to compete, what sort of health constraints will be need to be aware of for your horse in order for them to be able to participate in the competition when they get there. And I'm certainly mostly involved with horses competing in sport rather than racing, and so our competitors tend to largely be governed by the rules and regulations of the FEI, and the FEI have helped to facilitate that process significantly by making the sort of certification and pre-evaluation of the horse's health status electronic and via the FEI horse app that assists riders and trainers and owners with inputting the necessary data so that when they get to their destination, the vets at the arrivals station will be able to admit the horse smoothly into the stables rather than having to delay them at that stage of the journey. But it is worth, as far as the actual itinerary and the potential planning of stopover, accommodation, and the booking of tickets for planes or ships or however you're going to get there, it is often worth paying a professional to do that. And there are a number of bloodstock agents now who have gained, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, vast experience of navigating through this slightly more complicated minefield of getting horses across the channel. And so to some extent it is worth, if I can just get the slide to advance again. How do we go forward? Sorry, I've managed to lose the how's that? Right. So it is worth paying somebody to do some of the hard yards for you. And actually, although it seems expensive, it's nothing compared to the inconvenience and discomfort of arriving somewhere or not arriving somewhere and finding that you've not quite got the bits of paper that you needed to allow you to complete your journey. So whether you're traveling by sea or by air, traveling by sea, air, or road, there will obviously be different considerations and different implications for the route and how long it's going to take, and perhaps how many times you're going to need to stop en route in order to break the journey up. But there's some fairly basic things to think about, as we would do if we were ourselves going on a long car journey, and covering, making sure you've got the obvious fundamental nutritional ingredients, some food and water. It's probably the way most people would do it, but it's, for lots of reasons, makes good sense to take your own food and water with you. If you take your own food and water with you, you're going to reduce the possibility of picking up some unwanted contamination from another source of food or water. And as far as palatability is concerned, horses will often prefer to carry on eating the thing that they're familiar with at home, rather than necessarily switching to French water or Belgian grass or whatever it might be in the course of the journey as they undertake it. And as well as food and water, there might just be some supplements and medicines that might be appropriate to think about, particularly on a longer journey, to try and mitigate the sort of stresses that the body might experience as a result of prolonged time spent stood still, stood up, stood still in the horse box. Things like electrolyte supplements, which will help to keep the horse well hydrated, probiotics and antacids to try and help to stabilize the horse's digestive system and mitigate the risks of digestion related complications en route or soon afterwards. And then also particularly important if you're traveling somewhere to compete is to think about the impact that the journey is going to have on the horse's orthopedic performance subsequently. There is some evidence that horses travel best, or at least prefer to travel, given free choice, facing backwards. And obviously that does and can happen, but quite a lot of time horses will be traveling sideways. They might be traveling with horses that they don't necessarily stable next to and are familiar with at home. And there's a number of reasons why traveling may be more or less stressful for the individual animal, depending on how the accommodation for them has been planned out for the journey.
Tim, sorry, Tim, to interrupt. I think we might be stuck on a slide, because as yours move forward, because we're still on health papers and transport.
No,
I was thinking, I'm sure we've moved on, but
I've moved on. Yes.
Will it go forward? Is it stopped? Trying to see if I can do it subtly from here, but I don't think I can.
You can hear me, right? Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you perfectly well. It's just the background is still your health papers. It's not the end of the world, because we can share the slides.
Can you see that? No?
No, it's still health papers. It seems I've got stuck.
You're asking the wrong person, unfortunately, to be able to try and fix this particular problem.
Do you want me to, if I share my screen?
Yeah, if you can do it, that would be great.
Yeah, because I've got them all there for you. Let's go back to, so everyone just bear with 2 seconds. So what have you got to? Orthopedic considerations.
Orthopedic considerations, yeah.
There we go. Perfect. We're away.
Fine. So yes, there is some good evidence actually, but I mean, I think most of our common experience would be that journeys which are relatively short, journeys of 3 or 4 hours, have little measurable effects on horses' performance subsequently. And for that reason, it's quite common practice that in the UK to ship horses 3 or 4 hours to a competition or to a race, and to expect them to perform in their normal fashion and to their best. And actually, journeys of 3 or 4 hours in terms of North American or or Australian or other countries around the world terms are relatively short trips. But equally, when we start to get longer than that, can we move on to the slide?
It might let you do it. I've tried to control, so there you go, perfect, well done.
Oh, perfect, thank you. Yeah, journeys of longer than that. We know that, I mean, one of the simple measurable things that will change in a horse as a consequence of being shipped for a long distance on any means of transport will be that it will lose some body weight, and a lot of that body weight loss will be loss of water, and obviously they'll continue to eat, they'll continue to pass droppings, but they will tend to become a little bit depleted of water overall in the course of a journey, and that measurable parameter might take 2 or 3 days even to restore to normal following a journey, which gives us one crude measure anyway of how long it might take a horse to recover from a trip to the other side of the world by whatever road, train and plane means. And time needs to be factored in at the destination then to allow them the opportunity to get over and minimise the after effects, if you like, of that travel. So what kind of things are we thinking about from a veterinary point of view specifically that we might be needing to deal with post-travel? Well, the commonest, or probably the number 1, 2 and 3 issues that we worry about will be the issues of fever, of a horse developing a high temperature following a journey. And so-called shipping fever is normally a respiratory infection which potentially can have quite significant implications for the horse and can be quite a nasty condition. It gets a significant grip on the patient, and it certainly at least could interfere with or scupper the opportunities for competition at the destination. So for that reason alone, it's worthwhile paying close attention to the horse's temperature during travel, because early recognition of a raised temperature will be helpful in allowing an intervention to try and minimise the subsequent implications of it. Colic is another thing which I always think probably is less frequent after long journeys than you might expect it to be, because journeys inherently tend to take away from the horse everything that it's familiar with in terms of its surroundings, the air that it breathes, and even sometimes the water that it drinks. And it's stood still, and it's not having its normal exercise, and it's probably with horses that it doesn't normally stand next to. And there's lots of reasons really why you would think it could trigger an episode of colic. And probably the most common colic form that we do see when we see colic post-travel will be effectively some form of constipation, where the horse's digestive tract has become a bit sluggish and the throughput of material has reduced. Azoturia is another of those things which you can certainly see there's a recipe there for it. Azoturia we see commonly in day-to-day practice in situations where fundamentally there's a mismatch between the amount of work that a horse is doing and the amount of food that it's consuming. And there's certainly a risk with long journeys that unless you modify the diet appropriately, then the horse may well be continuing to consume a ration which it would normally be eating at home when it's then going and doing an hour or 2 of ridden work of some sort or other. And if it carries on eating calories at that rate without necessarily getting some additional exercise during or before or after the journey phase of a horse box ride, then it may be that it then becomes at risk during after its arrival at the destination of developing azoturia in a conventional way. We see quite a lot of skin problems with horses travelling on long journeys, and they're not they're trivial things really in themselves. They're not going to be life-threatening, and hopefully they're not going to be risking being barred from entry to a stable or a border crossing, although that is a potential implication of a horse arriving at a stable, foreign stable yard covered in spots. Most of the time these urticarial reactions will be in horses which have been and they recently had their hair clipped. Certainly if they're going to compete in a hot climate, they may well be clipped before they depart. And the additional heat as you move towards your destination, the temperature rises, perhaps some foreign bugs and midges just seems to make them a bit more sensitive to reacting in this sort of nettle rash, allergic type fashion to things that perhaps wouldn't have troubled their immune systems before they left home. So it's a minor problem on the face of it, but it's something that we will see reasonably commonly with horses travelling to foreign climes. And then just in a more general way, it's understandable enough that horses might feel quite tired post journey, and in the same way that we often feel tired after flying somewhere on an aeroplane or sitting on a train for a long time. You haven't put a great deal of effort into the process, but it's just sometimes a bit of a wearing exercise and unfamiliar exercise, and so you just run the risk of arriving at your destination feeling a little bit flat. So I think I might have just jumped a slide. Actually, I'm just going to try and go back. Yeah, okay. So I said that fever was probably the number one thing that we worry about from a veterinary point of view in terms of how horses may fail to cope well with the journey. And so what kind of things can we do to minimise the risk of that happening? Well, I mean, the most fundamental thing probably, and hopefully normally a given, is that you set off with a healthy horse. But it's part of the reason why the health checks that the vet will do when issuing health papers pre-departure are important. And it's part of the reason why monitoring your horse's temperature at every opportunity during the journey period is a valuable thing to do, because these early temperature spikes can be really good heads up warning that there is something brewing. And rather than wait until the horse is clearly sick and gone off his food or coughing or got some nasal discharge, picking up on a temperature spike early on allows you to recognise that things might not be quite as they should be, and to think about some kind of intervention. Air hygiene, just the same as it would be at home, really. It's very important on a journey, and particularly when horses are travelling in relatively confined spaces. It's very much as is the case with housing horses in stables at home. It's flawed to think that it's a good idea to shut all the doors up and keep the drafts out to create a nice, warm, comfortable environment for the horse to rest and relax in, because actually they do benefit much more from having perhaps rugs and keeping their body warm by some form of clothing, but allowing the air around them to be frequently exchanged to maintain a good level of air hygiene, reduce the accumulation of pollutants like ammonia in the atmosphere, and to reduce the levels of dust that might be generated from forage or bedding. The head down posture is a concept which is also really important to keep in mind when you're travelling horses long distance, because a significant part of the immune system and protection of the airways is this mucociliary escalator, which we all have, horses, humans, dogs, cats. We all have this mechanism by which our lungs are able to cleanse themselves of contaminants to some degree. And the system works by the airways being lined with a mucus material which is a bit sticky. It will trap dust and dirt. It then gets propelled along the wall, the lining of the airways, towards the head, and then from there coughed or sneezed or expelled in one way or another from the head, so cleansing the lower airways of these potentially harmful substances. And in the horse particularly, the element of gravity is an important one in helping this system to be efficient. So the mucociliary escalator does work against gravity, as it does in upright standing human beings, but in horse it's much more efficient when periodically the head is down and gravity encourages that drainage of fluid and mucus from the lower airways to the upper airways, and from there to be expelled to the outside world. So look for opportunities when you're traveling to encourage horses to feed off the floor, or to graze from the floor, or to be taken off the horse box, so that they can recreate that posture, because it's quite a significant risk factor if horses are denied the opportunity to keep their heads down for the development of a fever, and subsequently then for the development of a respiratory infection. And to that end, it's really helpful if you can to break the journey. It's not always safe to get horses off the horse box, but there may be room to move the partitions a bit, to feed them from the floor, offer them water, and encourage them to stretch their heads and necks downwards. And if there is an opportunity and it's safe to do so, maybe to get them off the lorry and take them for a little bit of a leg stretch, just to help to ease any stiffness that might be developing as a consequence of standing still for a prolonged period of time. And also to maintain their hydration, because although that might not seem directly relevant to the respiratory system, keeping them well hydrated encourages these mucus secretions to remain a little bit more watery and a little bit more mobile, so that they can do their job in terms of moving through the airways and clearing debris from the lower respiratory tract. And if the horse becomes dehydrated, then one consequence of that will be that these secretions become thicker and less efficient at moving up and out from the lower airways. So colic, as I said, probably most commonly we would expect, if we're going to see colic, to see some sort of constipation, impaction type colic, and countering that would be using laxative feed, encouraging them to drink plenty, and simply, again, getting them off the horse box when possible to take them for a bit of a leg stretch, because physical movement is a tremendous tonic and stimulus for gut mobility. And just the same as if you had a horse with a bit of mild colic at home, the vet might advise you to take them for a bit of a walk and see if that would help to ease the situation. Then the same thing as a preventative measure is a very helpful strategy to adopt. Katie referenced ulcers in horses, and we've probably all groaned at the thought of the vet coming with the endoscope now and dishing out large quantities of super expensive ulcer medication. But the reality is ulcers are quite a common phenomenon. And again, our clients and ourselves are becoming increasingly understanding now of the kind of factors that can predispose horses to developing ulcers, and therefore better at recognising the risks earlier and reducing them. So things like feeding them frequently, feeding them little and often, feeding them plenty of fibre, not feeding them large starchy meals. Everybody now probably is very familiar with these concepts, and they're absolutely as applicable during a journey as they would ever be at home. And sometimes we do certainly recognise individuals who are particularly susceptible to the ulcer syndrome, and they may well be pre-medicated and medicated during the journey with anti-ulcer medicine to try and reduce their risk of developing symptoms as a consequence of their travel stress. And I said we want to do these things frequently. We want to feed and water them at least every 4 hours. Lots of the time they'll have free access to forage through a hay net during the journey, and if we can make the opportunity every 4, 5, 6 hours to have a break, have a bit of a rest from the travel process and get their heads down, then so much the better. Azoturia, yeah, well, we understand, I think, fundamentally enough the basic problem: too much food, not enough exercise. You can't do much about the exercise bit, so you have to modify the diet to try and reduce your risk. My favourite travel nutrition is pictured in the caption below. I think probably German Haribo and low sugar Coca-Cola, highly recommended for keeping you going on these long road trips. Probably not good athlete food, but yeah, I think we're probably less at risk of azoturia as well. Fatigues, yeah, it's a bit of a difficult one to measure. I mean, there are lots of people have looked in lots of ways at trying to measure parameters of the horse's well-being to try and identify the sort of negative impacts and consequences of travel. Fortunately, happily, most horses travel very well, and if they're familiar with travel, I think that's an important concept as far as long distance travel is concerned. Experience allows horses, in the same way that it does people, to cope with journeys better. So you would expect young horses who are not so familiar with the concept of being stood in a horse box for a long time, or young horses who are in the company of other horses who haven't travelled before, to generate a more stressful environment potentially than those old stagers who've done it all before and travelled many miles around the globe and actually just settle quickly into their comfortable routine on the plane or on the train or wherever they are, and find the whole process altogether less strenuous to cope with. But again, it's worth thinking about the sort of recovery phase at the other end of a long journey, and if you are travelling significantly around the world, to compete at a high level, then it's absolutely vital that you allow enough time to arrive at the destination so that by the time the competition itself starts, then the horse will be feeling absolutely tip-top again, ready to give up his best. I can't quite see what's on the bottom of the slide, but we certainly encourage riders to take their horses out prior to loading in the morning if we're having a long day on the road, and again in the evening after we've arrived somewhere, even if it's 10 o'clock at night and it's pitch black, finding somewhere that the horses can be led around an indoor school or taken for a bit of a walk around a field that's safely enclosed, just because giving them a bit of a leg stretch before and after they've had a long standstill phases seems really helpful to minimise the overall impact of a journey. I think, having said that journeys are not great for improving horses' soundness, and I try to refrain from trotting horses up when we arrive at an overnight stop in the middle of a multiple day trip, because I know that I'll only give myself sleepless nights on the rest of the journey if we do too much soundness evaluation and immediately they come down the horse box ramp, and prefer instead to get them safely to their destination and then give them a little bit of recovery time before we get too stressed about whether they're still in tip-top condition to start the competition. Obviously, if you do have the opportunity for grazing, then it's worth just giving some consideration to what your horse is grazing, particularly if you're in a foreign country. Grass is grass, but it's not necessarily if you're in some exotic climb, and it may be that it's safer to walk them and then rely on your own forage for their feed intake, rather than giving them what seems like a bit of a treat in the field next to the stable yard there. So prevention, as with so many things, is really much more efficient than cure. And if you can foresee the kind of problems you might run into on a journey and try to plan ahead to avoid them, then so much the better. I think fundamentally, horses are such creatures of habit that it is surprising, really, how well they tolerate being travelled for sometimes several days at a time, and certainly many thousands of miles at a time, with quarantine periods at either end of the journey that can equally be quite alien environments for the horses to stand in. It's pleasing and surprising at the same time that they seem to cope, by and large, remarkably well with these sorts of mega trips. If you do remember that, of course, that as well as more kind of big deal veterinary things, there's plenty of little first aid situations that can arise on a journey, whether it's slapping off the ramp on the way during the loading process, or one horse biting another in the stall next door when they've just been loaded up. So take your first aid kit with you, and do remember to take your horse's change of footwear if you're particularly if the horse is wearing something exotic, because once you arrive at your destination, although you'll probably be able to get access to a farrier, you may not necessarily be able to get access to all the sort of exotic bits and pieces that you would have necessarily relied upon at home. I think this is the end for me. Thank you for bearing with my presentation.
Brilliant. No, thank you ever so much, Tim. I'm going to stop the screen share just while hopefully James is joining us. The campaign, I think, for strangles awareness is around the slogan "Hot before snot," which came to mind when you said about doing the temperature checks. So, I mean, that is something we can all do, and certainly I think it was Red Wings presenting at the weekend that was talking about knowing what your horse's normal is, because they were showing some real ranges in sort of average temperatures in their sort of trial work that they'd done. So I guess that's something we can all do and get familiar with, taking temperature regularly whenever we're going to help spread, disease, even in the UK, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it's a really useful bit of information, and it's dare I say, a relatively simple process to take the temperatures now, because it's an obligation of the FEI regulations that horses' temperatures are taken twice a day throughout competitions and in the preceding days, and logged on their app as well. It's unfortunate that the only way really still to get a reliable temperature check on a horse is by rectal temperature. So it's why it makes everybody's life a lot easier if the horse is used to having their temperature taken rather than suddenly has some strange vet bearing down on them at an event for the first time to do that. There have been and will continue to be, I'm sure, various evaluations of non-invasive temperature monitoring, thermographic screening, and that kind of thing, which may at some point be considered a sufficiently accurate alternative to reduce the need to get out the thermometer and place it where the sun doesn't shine. But that's, at the moment, that is the best way to do it.
Yeah, and if anyone is interested in learning, I think they've got some really good educational videos to help. I can't remember who they'd used, but they'd used a high profile rider to help awareness of the technique and doing it and things. But yeah, if it's helping spread, reduce the risk of disease spreading, because obviously the horse is showing the change in temperature before the other signs are apparent. So yeah, it was really useful. And the other thing that I thought was a really good point you made, and I didn't cover it off, was the using forage at competitions, because there have been some quite high profile cases of people traveling abroad on things like the Sunshine Tour, using the forage supplied, and actually, you would assume if a competition centre is offering that forage, it's going to be safe, but it wasn't. It actually then resulted in positive Nutr tests. So not only in terms of what the horse is familiar with, but risk management. Don't assume, especially when you're going abroad, and James will probably comment on that more than me, but there's definitely been some cases in recent years where actually the forage supplied by the venue. James, do you want to comment on the legal side of that? Because we are encouraging a lot more of our riders to take forage with them if they can. It's bulky, that's the problem.
Yeah, it was interesting to hear that. I mean, it sort of makes, to my mind, perfect sense, but I would expect somebody to say, well, that's terribly impractical, you shouldn't do it, and you're just being a finicky lawyer. So I think that's a great idea. I mean, I know from some of the cases I've done that I've got prohibited substances turning up in grass, under thresholds, etc. So the more that you can control those risks, the better. I mean, if you were able to, I suppose, let's just take a hypothetical scenario where your horse tested positive, down to an input abroad, then I mean the question would again come down to reasonable precautions. And I think the fact that you can take these things with you would speak against contention that you're somehow that you've taken all reasonable precautions. But more importantly, if you can control those inputs, you just control the risk. And the more you can do that, the more you can control the risk, the less likely you are to end up in that situation. So I think it's really encouraging to hear that is possible. And certainly from a legal standpoint, I think that just sounds like best practice. Yes.
And in terms of Tim, I was thinking special considerations in terms of competing hot to cold. Sorry, that's flitting between topics, but just while it comes to mind, do you advise people to try and acclimatise horses if they can before they travel? Is that even? I know I've heard of endurance riders going out to Dubai and they literally spend hours exercising in loads of rugs and things to try and replicate that sort of heat stress. Do you think is it worth doing? Is there any merit in doing that kind of thing?
I think opinions are quite divided on that. I think riders often find it's a bit intrusive. Trying to training horses in rugs brings with it its own problems. They're actually not able to dispel heat in a normal and efficient way with a rug on. They get problems then with rugs rubbing them and causing unintended consequences. So I think there's a lot of debate, and even amongst the international teams there would be some variation about whether people feel it's more efficient to fairly much parachute into a big event, give the horse a few days to recover from the immediate obvious effects of a journey, but then compete and then leave. And then there'd be those who felt actually, depending on factors like climate changes, like time zone changes, whether they think it's better to try and get some sort of pre-competition hub outside of the venue where they can spend a month, say, properly acclimatizing to the local conditions, and there just genuinely are some. There's obviously cost implications for strategies like that, but I think there's quite a lot of disparity of opinion as well. Going back to your comments about the the event provision of forage and feed, though, I mean, it is interesting again how differently different countries manage these things and how different individuals do. And I've seen even this summer at European Championships, one team which brought all of their own water for their horses for the entire week. So they took no water from the venue, never mind, obviously they had their own forage, they had their own feed, but they literally had bottled water for their dressage horses. So it was quite a good illustration of a country really taking that principle to the extreme of leaving no risks of an unwitting contamination from something that was provided to them by the OC. So
yes, that is going to the ultimate, isn't it, with your water? Because I guess
good if you had shares in Evian or Perrier or whichever it was. But
yeah, and on the sort of substances, I mean, I think I would say, James, I don't know whether you would agree, but I think sometimes we only get to hear the high profile ones in the media, and sometimes that leads to a little bit of complacency that, oh, it's not going to happen to me. But these things are happening all the time, aren't they? There's ongoing cases. If you look on the FEI website, there's great big long lists of prohibited substance issues.
Unfortunately, there are, and you're right. And the trouble is, it's a system geared up as well for evidential proof, which requires lawyers. And so if you are an extremely high profile rider, obviously that's going to have probably greater reputational consequences, but generally they're in a better position to be able to prove their innocence under the rules. And if you're not in that situation, it's really extremely onerous. So to me, prevention's so much better than cure in that situation. If you can you can't reduce the risks to zero. It's just not possible. Accidents can happen, etc. But you can do so much to reduce those risks. And these rules apply at all levels through competition. So that's why, to some extent, it's even more important if you're not at that sort of elite level to make sure you don't have a situation where you're contesting a case, because the equality of arms is going to be so much more different in that situation.
Are there any substances that you see as the sort of hot ones, so to speak, that are coming up or more and more frequently, or anything that's...
Just looking at the case status table earlier, I had it up actually, I've just put it down again. So, but I mean, you're still seeing some of the specified substances, caffeine, theophylline, substances like that appear on the Nutr. From the on the control medication side, you still see, lidocaine, phenylbutazone, those kind of cases. I mean, there's a few I can't talk about actually at the moment, but are really quite interesting with what's turning up in there. And you've talked about water. I can't really say too much more than that. But that's quite interesting. You're still getting the weird and wonderful, not very wonderful substances. And I mean, if you look at it, so there are quite a few sort of endurance cases there with some substances which, I mean, the FEI will take a very, very dim view of those substances, quite rightly. But you're certainly still seeing those specified substances. So you're still seeing these sort of very not commonplace, I don't want to say that, not commonplace contamination, but it's clearly not doping, these substances, but you're still in situations of people having to contest cases and end up with periods of ineligibility off the back of them.
And Tim, on the withdrawal periods, as from the veterinary perspective, do you tend to go above what perhaps the producer of the medicine is recommending to be on the safe side, or how do you advise your clients on things like that?
I think you always want to err on the side of caution because of the consequences of getting it wrong. There is some data available to help guide it. In the old days, it was very different. You had to speak to your mates and see who'd had any bad experiences and when that had happened, and see if you could piece together what sort of relevant timeframes might be. Nowadays, the FEI is much more helpful. It does conduct and fund investigations to try and give us some more scientific guidelines, but you have to remember that always individuals will handle medications differently depending on what their condition of the animal is when it's being treated. It may metabolize a drug differently to a healthy animal that took part in some sort of scientific trial in cold blood. So I think the biggest potential problem for riders to be aware of is that of contamination, accidental contamination of feed, bowls, buckets, scoops, that sort of thing, with orally administered medicines. It's one thing to inject something and know that you injected it at 9 o'clock on Monday morning, and then the clock starts ticking in a reasonably predictable way as to when that's going to be metabolized. But if it went into a bucket at 6 o'clock in Monday evening and the horse kicked its food around the stable a bit and then finished its breakfast at 2 o'clock in the morning, and then another horse went in there in the afternoon and hoovered up what was left, then suddenly you've got medicines going in unintended places, and that's when it's very relatively easy to avoid if you think about it. But actually, if you don't think about it, it's very easy to end up with a horse getting some regulate in its feed that wasn't even a mare, or bute in its feed that wasn't supposed to be having it in the first place. And that's when those are the sort of things you really need to try and avoid by good stable management.
Yeah. And it's so difficult. I mean, I alluded to it, and the more you sort of look at animals, plants, everything else, the more you realise there is no consistency at all in how they behave or react to any sort of change in their world. So yeah, it's a tricky scenario. Anyway, I'm very conscious of time, so I just want to sort of round up by saying thank you both very much indeed. Some really informative presentations, and I know we could go on discussing the whys and wherefores of it for a long time, but just to reiterate our appreciation for you giving up your time this evening and obviously preparing your presentations. We will have some tokens of our appreciation on their way to you, but I'd also like to make a donation to a charity of each of your choice. So when you get a few minutes, if you don't mind emailing me, we'll make a donation subsequent to
Lovely, thank you.
This evening. And I do have to end the webinar for everyone, so I'm really sorry because I'm going to end up cutting you all off, but thank you ever so much again, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.